I want to take you through my basic wildlife photo editing workflow. The first thing I do is I bring things into Lightroom. I like to start there to cull my photos before I do any type of processing. So today I was out shooting some birds in a nearby river, and I didn't have too much time before it started raining, but there was one specific spot I wanted to try something a bit creative. So I only have a couple pictures here, which will make this easy. And I have everything organized in one folder, then by location, and finally then let Lightroom automatically do it by date. So we're going to import everything here. And now there's a bunch of different ways to do this. Whatever really works best for you is the important thing. In my case, what I do is I go through, and the ones that I want to keep in this stage, I give a 1-star rating. And so I'm just going to go through these quick. And like these where he's looking away from the camera, I'm not going to bother keeping. And let's see. And that's not to say all of these are good, but this is kind of like a first getting rid of the stuff I really don't have any use for. So now I can just sort this by unrated, flip over to the tile view, select all, delete, delete from disk. And I don't format my memory cards right away until they get pretty close to full. So I do have a secondary backup if I accidentally deleted something from the disk that I actually did want to save. And now in this case, I've got 6 images that I want to process. And my first processing step is to open up DxO Pure Raw. Now, once I have all of these images culled to the ones I want to edit, I'm going to open up here in Explorer. I'm going to take those images and I am going to drag them here into DxO Pure Raw. And we're going to go ahead and process them. So at this point, we're going to take a pause because that's going to take a couple minutes. And now we're done. And we're going to export now this back to Lightroom. So DxO Pure Raw does a really great job at knocking out noise, a bit of sharpening. Unfortunately, I have this really weird issue where sometimes images just will get knocked out to black. They've actually given up and said we can refund you your money if you'd like. And for some reason, DxO Pure Raw 2 also has that problem for me. But it's such a great program that it doesn't bother me. I just redo the image or pull the raw file back if I really wanted that one. But these are mostly the same shot, so in this case, I'll just end up deleting it. So now that I've brought them back into Lightroom, we did the first important step, DxO Pure Raw, especially if you're shooting at a higher ISO, which I wasn't today, but especially for higher ISO images, it really does wonders and allows you to shoot at a much higher ISO than you would otherwise. Now, what I want to do is I want to get rid of the old original RAW files, just because the DxO Pure Raw images are quite big, and so storage becomes a concern very quickly. So what I'm going to do now is go back to the root folder here. Right, let's see, 6, 7. So you can see all of them. And then the other handy thing, since we sorted them, or rated them, now I can just sort by rated, the opposite of what we did before, and delete all of those. Now before I actually start editing, I will go through and tag what species is in the photos. It's easy in this case because it's all the same for all 7 images. And let's go ahead and get rid of this picture. Now, let's choose one of these to use as an example, which one I like the look of the most. I think this one I like. What I was going for, as you can see, we have a 1/15th of a second shutter speed. That's not what I would normally be using for wildlife photography. But there's this spot here where there's some pools of water. And what I wanted to try to do was see, especially since this bird likes to stand still, if I could get a bit of a silky look to the water behind him. So I achieved that. I'm fairly happy with it. I would have needed an ND filter to go any more because I was already at ISO 100 and f16. So this was the best I could do, was about 1/15th of a second without losing anything in the highlights. So now we're going to go over here to our Develop tab. And I have some presets that are from Glenn Bartley and Jan Wagner. I really like these. I use them on pretty much all of my images. Just to give you an idea, it gives you a great starting point. So in this case, we have a bit of yellow They mostly work with reds and yellows, as well as other things like tricky light and standard profiles. Since there's a bit of red, we can see what that one looks like, which is fairly good. But let's just see what the Jack of all trade ones looks like. Yeah, I think I like the looks of the red. Yeah, this red punchy, I think, looks good. Now, let's go ahead and crop this down and try to do it, just about there, rule of thirds. And let's move that over just a little bit and see what that looks like. I think that's going to be a little too much headroom. Yeah, that looks a bit better. I'm going to eventually try to get rid of that leaf there in the background. So we have a good starting spot now. And it depends on what exactly you're looking for with the image. The first thing I tend to do is check the exposure. In this case, I'm pretty much where I want to be. I'm in the upper 2/3 of my histogram. I don't have anything that's peaking or anything that's crushed in the shadows. I can tell that I want the blacks to be darkened a bit. There we go, that's looking good. And the whites, I think if I bring them up much more, I'm going to start losing stuff in the water. But I can bring it up just a little bit. That'll bring up some of the midtones. In this case, I'm going to go with a bit more saturation than I normally would, just because of the reds that we have in here. So Adobe designed the vibrance and saturation tools that generally I would use vibrance because it tends to be a little bit more subtle. You can see here, I can have it, let's say, up to 50, and it's definitely oversaturated, but it's not terrible. But if I took the saturation up to 50, it's much stronger. But they specifically created the vibrance and saturation tools to handle skin tones. And that means that the vibrance tool or vibrance slider touches reds and oranges, if I remember right, a little bit less than the saturation tool. And since we have kind of those reddish colors that are more in human skin tones, I'm going to bring this up probably about 14 and then also bring the general vibrance up. And now we've got just enough that it's starting to pop. In fact, I think I'm going to take that back just a little. And later I'm going to bring down a bit the yellows just because his legs are looking a bit too poppy. Now, contrast-wise, I think I could bring up the contrast a little bit here. That'll help kind of separate him from the background. And I really like using the dehaze tool. I find it really gives a great look. Sometimes what I'll even do is I'll take the dehaze and then I will proportionately kind of bring up the blacks just a little. And I found that it helps the image to have just a bit more of a dynamic quality to it than it normally would. So at this point, we've got a fairly good starting spot. I like to raise the shadows a little bit, usually on birds, depending on the light. In this case, it was a very overcast day, so there's not really any harsh shadows, but still, that way we can see a little bit more there under his chin. The highlights are pretty good. If I raise them, the water is going to get really kind of freaky, but if I bring them down too much, it's going to look weird too. So I think bringing them down just a little is going to help that you can see there's water behind there, without making it too distracting. Now, we do have some distracting elements that we're going to need to take care of, this leaf and this leaf that are right there. But first, I want to go down here, and let's take the saturation on our yellows down just a little bit. Yeah, there we go. So you can see the difference. Very kind of yellowy, not only the legs, but also the rocks. Now we've brought that down a little bit, and it looks more natural. Now, I haven't touched the clarity or texture sliders yet, and that's because that's something I want to do as a local adjustment rather than a global adjustment. And with the Select Subject tool that's in Photoshop 2022 now, it's great for working on birds. It's so much easier than before when I would do it with a brush and brush over the bird's body. So we've got the subject selected. In this case, I think it'll be okay. I might end up knocking out this area between his legs. But let's just take up the clarity just a little bit. You can see some details being brought into the feathers. Same thing, the texture. I don't want to get too over the top with that. Okay, I think we're pretty good there. Now, this area right in here, I'm not particularly liking what it looks like. So I'm going to take a brush in here, make that a lot smaller. And sometimes it does this to me. I'm not sure why. It doesn't like the brush. There we go. So let's make that smaller. And let's paint in through there. Bring the highlights down just a little, and in particular the whites. Not quite that much. There we go. No, that was too much. There we go. Okay. I'm not going to go through the rest of the workflow at this point on all the other little minor tweaks that I'm going to make, for example, getting rid of the branch and the leaf there. But the next step in my workflow is to take it over into Topaz Denoise. Now, I don't really need any noise reduction in this one because normally I'm shooting birds that are either in the rainforest or in not quite as good of light conditions. So in this case, I am going to go ahead here and I'll start with auto, but I find it usually is a little bit too intense. I tend to like to look at the face. So let's bring this sharpness down quite a bit. There's almost no noise, so let's see. In fact, I don't really even, I'm going to completely turn off the noise reduction there and just let this do some sharpening. So I do like the sharpening it's doing there. Makes the feathers just stand out a little bit better. And I think even I could reduce that a little. No, I think it's about good where it was before. There we go. So I'm going to apply that. And then the last step is, after this automatically comes back into Lightroom, I want to take and export it with my preferred export settings. Again, after I've done some other tweaks, but I have some presets that I've saved that will export it for different things with settings like for Instagram, for uploading to stock photo websites and things like that. So that gives you a brief idea of my basic wildlife editing workflow.